Hi, this is Kirk O'Connor, and in today's tutorial we're going to talk a little bit about domain names and name servers and all those sort of things that turn most people off, but very important when we are making your website work. So just to give you a little bit of background information, here we have our first diagram, and this is going to show the simplest of situations here, and the simplest of situations is up the top. We look at a domain registrar. Now this is the place from which you buy your domain name. Now this might be a crazydomains.com.au in case of our Australian clients, or it might be a Namecheap, or it might be a GoDaddy.com, or any number of places, a Melbourne IT, wherever, where you buy your domain name. Now, when you buy your domain name, you will be sent an email by the domain registrar, and that email will have a login username and a password so you can go in and manage your account. Now, when you manage your domain name account, you'll find in there that there are these things called name servers. Now, what do name servers do? Well, name servers are very simply a name and an associated IP address that point to wherever your website is being hosted. Now, when you first purchase your domain, what you'll find is the name servers are set to point to a default page in the domain registrar's account, which gives you some information basically saying that this name has been registered. So that's sort of like a placeholder, if you like. Now, some domain registrars, Crazy Domains would be one of them, GoDaddy is another, probably most of them also provide hosting. So you could in fact host your account or host your website on the domain registrar's hosting server. Commonly, we have found that most companies don't tend to do the two things particularly well, especially if you're looking at WordPress websites where you need a host that really does have support, that has an understanding of WordPress and has done WordPress before and understands the issues that may come up. And look, what always is the situation that when you need help from your server or from your host, you want to make sure that they actually understand what they're doing, and quite often people who register domains really don't understand WordPress that well. Not always, but quite often we've found. So, if we are going to host your website, what we will need you to do, or what we'll do for you if you provide us with the information, is we need to change here these name servers and this IP address, which is simply a numerical representation of this name here, to point to our host. So all we're saying there for the domain is that the website and the email and associated things are all now resident on this host down here. We see remote host server. This might be our host, it might be a host that you select, it can be any host, but all we're saying is we are using this to route the domain name to this server here. It doesn't mean that the domain name moves. The domain name always remains with the domain registrar, and you can change your domain name or move your domain name from registrar to registrar, although we would recommend against that, as it can have effect on your search engine optimization if you have had your domain name with one registrar for a while. But you can, if you wanted to host in one place and then changed your mind later on and wanted to host into another place, you could change the name servers again, relocate your website to another host, and that wouldn't have that sort of effect on your search engine optimization. So you have flexibility with your hosting. Of course, there is some work to be done in moving a website from host to host, and that has some associated expense and pain, I guess. So, if we look at the remote host / server here, let's assume that that's our remote host. So what's happening is it is hosting your email and hosting your website. Normally, we're able to gain access to that account via a control panel. Commonly, the better hosts use something called cPanel, which is very, very usable. Other hosts use either proprietary variations or something like Plex or whatever. We find cPanel, maybe because that's what we used to, but we find cPanel to be the best and easiest. Providing web hosting and email hosting. Obviously, there is a file transfer protocol or an FTP account, so people can load, and in this case we can load information to and from the directory where your website is. We can host mail elsewhere by adding what are called MX or mail exchange records that point to another host. Obviously, WordPress requires a database, so we have to be able to add databases, and sometimes we find some of the cheaper hosting solutions that people select do not allow for the number of databases that are required. So be very careful when you are choosing inexpensive hosting, because what you will also find is they will limit the email addresses that you have, or the memory that you're allowed to use, or the disk space, and this can cause you a lot of problems in your install or later on. So cheap hosting is never a good alternative. Linux and Windows-based servers are commonly available. Linux by far the better for WordPress rather than Windows. Linux is definitely a requirement for our sites. And on some hosts, subdomains can be added if you need to use subdomains for other functionality. But once again, you would think long and hard before using a subdomain, because if you install a site and content on a subdomain, you are not getting the search engine optimization value from that site on your main site. So there have to be very good reasons for doing that. Okay, well, in some situations we understand that it's not all cut and dried, and you may want to do things a little bit differently. Let's look at some of those situations. So if we just scroll up here, and here we have a situation where we have an existing remote host server. However, someone wants to host their web server somewhere else. And the reason they would commonly do this is because they're on a host where they currently have their email, and maybe that host is not a particularly great host for a WordPress install. So they are happy to move their website to another host. Perhaps that's our host, because obviously we select a hosting provider that is really good at doing WordPress. However, they don't want to move their email. They want their email to stay where it is, because if you did, and let's just scroll up again and show here, once you move these name servers, once you change these name servers here to point to a different host, then your web server and your email server will go to that new host. So if your email is on a current host and your website is on a current host, once you change these two values at the domain registrar in your domain management account, you will lose your current website and you will lose your current email. So that's not always an option for people. So we have this situation where, rather than changing the name servers, you can look at your existing remote host or server, log into that cPanel account, and what you can do is you can create an A record for the web server and the FTP account to link to the new remote host server. So what you're doing is you're leaving the email where it is, you are creating what's called an A record, and that will then point to the remote web server. The reason we would take the FTP across as well is because we have to create an A record that allows us to change data in the server for the website. So that would do that. So to do that, what you would need from us and what you would ask us to provide you with is the IP address of our remote host or server. So that would be a single IP address, and you would use that IP address to create this A record. So that A record is then pointing to our server here where the website would be located. And of course you would do the same for the FTP account. You would point that to the IP address that we give you to point to our web server. So in this situation we have the email being continued to be hosted where it was previously on the existing host, and we have the website being hosted on a new host, which quite commonly would be our host. Okay, we also have a situation where the opposite is the case, where people might want to host their website in a particular place, however they might want to host their email in a different place. The situation slightly different there. We have our existing remote host server with our web server and our FTP account, which are not going to change. However, for our email server, what we're going to do is create MX records for the email account to link to the new remote host mail server. And obviously to do that, if you want to host your mail somewhere else, we wouldn't host mail by itself, but there are people that would do that, that would provide a let's say a superior mail service or a specific mail service that your IT professionals would prefer. What they would do is they would provide us with the MX record information, which we would then enter into the cPanel of your hosting account with us to point the mail records to the new remote server or your mail server that your IT professionals have set up. So very quickly, let's just go back and recap. Up the top we have the simplest situation whereby your hosting is with your domain registrar. Not so common. We have the most common implementation where you have your domain name with your domain registrar. We have a couple of name servers, a second for redundancy, that point to a remote host server where your website and your email is hosted. That would be the most common situation. Then we have some variations available whereby your email is hosted on your original server, however your website has been moved to a more WordPress friendly server, and that's done via an IP address and an A record. And then another situation whereby your web server is left where it is and your email is sent to another server, which would perhaps be a recommendation of your IT professionals for various reasons. This has been Kirk O'Connor. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation today, and you can find other email and WordPress tutorials on our website.